I'm Phil Archer. I'm Deputy Director at Reynolda House. Thank you to Emily and Anna for working out all the AV and the refreshments from our break. And thank you to Latasha, who was here yesterday getting the room ready for us. For a number of years, I've had the pleasure of assisting David with his class visits to Reynolda. I know he has a number of students in the room from through the decades. I wanted to give just my personal perception of the way he teaches, and I get to see it in person in this museum. The students generally get lost, and our biggest challenge whenever they come is finding them all in different parts of the house and bringing them back together into the reception hall, because they're tracing these reflections and angles of incidents through the themes that he's introduced in the class. But it turns the house into a sort of mirrored fun house of American art history. And they're not walking through with a checklist of curricular landmarks to check off. They're actually exploring and discovering and playing. And the house, almost never feels that alive. So it's been really a joy. And now we get to keep bringing the variations and the permutations on these themes with Dr. Martin Berger. And Martin is the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he oversees strategic planning, academic affairs, student affairs, enrollment, community engagement, libraries, and special collections. Wow. Martin's scholarship focuses on American art in the 19th and 20th centuries, with a particular emphasis on constructions of gender and race. His latest book, Inventing Stereotype, Race, Representation, and Interwar America, will be published this year by the University of Chicago Press. It proposes to upend a century of scholarly and popular thinking about stereotypes, tracing its origins to the 1920s when American journalist and public intellectual Walter Lippmann borrowed the term from the techniques of lithography. Lippmann defined the stereotype as a shared mental picture that simplifies a person, an event, a group, or a thing so that it could be more easily understood. So as Walter explains it, it did not have a pejorative notion or meaning or inflection when it was first coined. Inventing Stereotypes analyzes plays, novels, and paintings from the 1920s and 30s that intersect with racial stereotypes about depictions of blacks, Jews, and other minority individuals. Thinking especially about audience response to these images, Berger's book illustrates how artistic depictions have been historically categorized as either stereotyped or not, and it will be published in October. Berger's previous books include Man-Made, Thomas Eakins and the Construction of Gilded Age Manhood, published by the University of California Press in 2000, and Sight Unseen, Whiteness and American Visual Culture from the same press in 2005. Sight Unseen won the John C. Kowalty Award from the American Culture Association, and though it treats of late 19th and early 20th century art and popular culture, I think it could not be any more timely today. Martin received his BA in English and Art History from Wesleyan University and his PhD in American Studies from Yale, where naturally he studied with David Lubin. So please give a warm first visit welcome to Martin Berger.
Thanks very much. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm struck by the fact that Jennifer, Alex, and myself, we all come at American art history from different directions. You'll see some commonalities, I think, in our work, but it's really testament to David that we were allowed, in some sense, to go in our different directions. He is really, we're all his heirs, but he's had a kind of generosity of allowing his students, his mentors, his advisees to go in different directions. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. He's never tried to build people in his own mold. I met David almost 42 years ago in August of 1983 in Bixler Hall at Colby College. I enrolled in the first half of a European art survey course that he team taught with 3 art historians, and I was also assigned to David's weekly discussion section. He was a newly hired assistant professor, fresh from completing his American Studies PhD, and I was a first-year undergraduate. David remains frozen in my memory in the 1980s. This is how he'll always look to me. Libby too. I found David's lectures a revelation and enjoyed our discussion sections even more. While David played a significant role in my eventual decision to enroll in an American Studies PhD program, the lectures of his that I found so captivating were on Etruscan funerary art and Netherlandish genre painting. The European survey concluded hundreds of years before the advent of US art, and this course was the only one I ever took with David. Yet David was David, regardless of media, period, or culture. I could trace for you his ideological lineage through new criticism and deconstruction, and emphasize that his method was empowering for the latitude it accorded students with little historical background to use their powers of observation to engage with the past. That would all be true, even as it's insufficient for capturing his unique appeal. Consider David's explanation of his method in an essay published in Wiley's Companion of American Art. Quote, "I have always been an aleatory writer, one who relies on chance encounters with an idea, a conversation with a colleague, an exchange with a student, or a stray piece of reading to move from points A to B to C. My scholarship in both research and writing phases was anything but systematic, and it's hard, therefore, to delineate a strict methodological procedure that I have followed and would recommend to others. I do believe, however, that serious art history can be conducted in a playful and idiosyncratic manner." Close quote. That really is David. This passage contains several revealing observations. I'm confident that if Ernst Gombrich had lost the unpublished manuscript for Art and Illusion in a Fire, he would have eventually reconstituted the text for publication. I'm just as confident that if David had similarly lost the manuscripts for Act of Portrayal or Shooting Kennedy, he'd have published two unrecognizably different books. Given the role of chance in his method, I don't believe that David could have readily recreated either book, and I'm certain he would have had little interest in doing so. The author's puckish presence, as Elizabeth Johns once put it, would remain, even as his lines of inquiry would have been distinct. Why? Because he'd have interacted with different colleagues and students as he rewrote the chapters, read different scholarly books and popular articles along the way, seen different movies, television shows, and commercials. David's approach is aleatory for sure. In 1985, David gave me a copy of his just published book, Act of Portrayal, Aiken's Sargent James. I found it electrifying. At the time, I knew nothing of deconstruction or the scholarly earthquake of post-structuralism more broadly, whose aftershocks still rippled through the humanities and social sciences in the mid-1980s. The book felt subversive to me on multiple levels. First, it was an academic book that was both funny and self-referential. It jettisoned the cool, detached prose I associated with scholarly articles. The academic writing I had read up until that point aimed for the reader to lose sight of the author and immerse oneself in the subject of the book. With Act of Portrayal, that was impossible, as the author was with you on every page. I've long believed that I arrived at graduate school better prepared than were some of my peers, not because the book made me more knowledgeable about 1980s America, but because it forced me to consider how the collection and assessment of evidence and the presentation of an argument entailed choices. Years before I read Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, David encouraged me to read as a writer. Second, it ignored what I'd previously thought were the scholarly rules of temporality. It analyzed texts from the Gilded Age, but toggled between observations on late 19th and late 20th century America. David's chapter on Aiken's Agnew Clinic exemplified what I loved about the book. As is famously recounted by art historians, the sitter of the painting, the surgeon, Dr. David Hayes Agnew, on the left of the screen and painting, was keenly aware of the public's negative reaction to the glistening blood dripping off Dr. Gross's hand and scalpel in Aiken's earlier surgical portrait on the right, and insisted that he not be depicted with blood. Agnew wished to be represented as a healer, not a butcher. David noted the attachment of art historians to the famous anecdote and explained that they trotted it out in an effort to contrast Aiken's realist credentials with the squeamishness of polite Philadelphia society. But he added that art historians also retold the story in their lectures to establish their personal distance from the supposedly narrow-minded Americans of the past. As David explained, quote, "It is used in today's art history lectures for a purpose every bit as moralistic in its own way as those 19th century strictures of taste to which the present-day teller of the tale implies were superior," close quote. I thrilled to see him call into question present-day practices and values, given that the academics who taught me in the early 1980s rarely acknowledged the present. We all pretended that our classroom lectures and discussions were objective and hermetically sealed off from the world. Third, and most significantly, David reveled in the rich and contradictory nature of text. I had been taught to look for the singular meaning of a text, but David demonstrated their limitless potential to generate meaning. An incomplete list of the distinctive ways in which David described Dr. Agnew in active portrayal includes, I'll take a breath here, teacher, surgeon, village butcher, 19th century swashbuckler, clergyman, Athenian philosopher, Hebrew lawgiver, lamb, god, hero, biblical scribe, statue, scientist, artist, critic, rocket, bomb, and saint. As David explained, the portrait of Dr. Agnew is never finished. A painter at work on a painting makes myriad changes in it, as does an author writing and rewriting text. But years, even centuries after the painter has laid down his brush or the author his pen, the creative work of revision continues as long as there are viewers to gaze at the image or read the text, close quote. To invoke another post-structuralist book that had a deep influence on my thinking, David reveled in complexity and contradiction. David settled into his mature style in his second book, as is often the case with scholars in the humanities. In that book, Picturing a Nation, Art and Social Change in 19th Century America, and in all the books that followed, David moderated his presentism by displaying greater interest in historical context and social formations. That said, the humor and self-referential asides, keen interest in how the past reflects on the present, and richness of texts and their contradictory readings remain staples of his approach. Whereas active portrayal gestured to the complexity of text for audiences in the 1880s, it leaned into illuminating the myriad ways in which present-day readers continued to make meaning from 19th century novels and paintings. David's subsequent books reversed this emphasis. The text studied remained just as rich, though he now placed greater emphasis on how the artwork's original, heterogeneous audiences made meaning, as he diminished the attention to the contributions of present-day readers. David did not, of course, invent his post-structuralist moves, and he was certainly not alone in bringing them to the study of American art. Brian Wolfe and Michael Fried each made distinctive contributions to invigorating the practices of Americanists with continental theory, and together these three scholars played significant roles in popularizing a methodologically adventurous approach to the study of US art and visual culture. David's teaching and writing has had a substantial impact on the visual and literary texts I've studied and the questions I've asked. My relationship to his methodological approach has been more fraught. I've wrestled with the legacy of David's approach to evidence, drawn in by his close attention to the visual details of texts, and made anxious by the seemingly limitless ways in which those texts are read. And it's taken me time to settle into a method that suited my values and temperament. To make concrete both my intellectual debt to and methodological struggle with David's art history, I'll share with you an excerpt from my recent analysis of an Archibald Motley painting. A decade after Motley's death in 1981, the Chicago Historical Society organized a large retrospective of the artist's work. The exhibition charted the career of an artist regarded as a unique chronicler of Black life. His reputation rested primarily on portraits and scenes of contemporary life created during the 1920s and 30s, which captured Black leisure in the clubs, bars, streets, and parks of Chicago's South Side. Reviewing Motley's retrospective at its DC venue in 1992, the longtime Washington Post art critic Paul Richard opined, quote, "His champions don't discuss it, but a smug superiority, a dehumanizing distance between the painter and his subject hollows out his art. He caricatured his people, though the catalog denies it. Motley, we are told by Howard University's Floyd Coleman, quote, was among the artists of the 1920s who consistently depicted African Americans in a positive manner. He extolled his African ancestry," close quote. Motley hoped to break down stereotypes, adds Jontil Teresa Robinson of Atlanta's Spielman College, who helped organize the show. The trouble with such claims is that they're often contradicted by the paintings on the walls. His African Americans, especially the males, are exaggerated. Their lips are over thick, their teeth are over white. Not always, but too often, they appear to be speaking in Amos and Andy dialect. At this junction in our history, Motley's vivid mixing of racial imagery and caricature is not easily digested. All of that was Paul Richards' Washington Post critique. The Post review in the 20th century art history it quotes see stereotypes in Motley's paintings, though the respective interpretations of stereotypes' function could not be more distinct. Whereas the newspaper critic contends that Motley is simply trafficking in stereotypes, the art historians perceive a progressive project to dismantle them. These disparate interpretations illustrate a dynamic that has haunted the reception of Motley's paintings from the late 1960s to the present. In the final third of the 20th century, there was growing consensus that some of his canvases contained obvious stereotypes and a tussle over what that revealed. Simply put, both art critic and art historians know that the paintings contain racial stereotypes because they see them. The evidence, as the Post critic put it, is, quote, hanging on the walls. But what if the visual evidence read differently in the 1920s and 30s? We know from Motley's unpublished autobiography and his many interviews that he consciously aimed to rid American art of racial stereotypes, and that he saw his depictions of Black Americans as a corrective to centuries of inaccurate depictions. And there's abundant evidence that members of the public, critics, reporters, and activists from the interwar era were united in their admiration of Motley's artwork, believing that it offered truthful depictions of Black life. In an era in which white and Black critics vigorously debated whether depictions were stereotyped or not, and Black critics fiercely criticized artists who were seen to traffic in stereotypes, not one of the hundreds of popular and scholarly references to Motley and his art that I've reviewed from the interwar period saw stereotype or caricature in the artist's work. White and Black critics, journalists, and intellectuals consistently praised the artist for the realness of depictions that chronicled modern Black life with, as one typical reviewer remarked, keen racial sympathy and understanding. Prominent Black supporters who championed Motley's art included some of the century's most thoughtful thinkers on race, including W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and Elaine Locke. This fall, as you heard, I'll publish a book, Inventing Stereotype, which illustrates how it is that characters appearing in works of literature, theater, and high art move from being categorized as stereotyped to non-stereotyped and vice versa. The book argues for the relative nature of stereotypes. It contends that characters deemed either stereotyped or non-stereotyped are so categorized relative to representational norms, not relative to their success in conveying the authentic identities of individuals or racial groups. Both seeing and not seeing stereotypes stem from social and psychological processes only loosely linked to what's depicted in works of literature and fine art. It's fair to note that some of the figures in Motley's artworks looked racially stereotyped to viewers today based on current visual and racial context, though it's not justifiable to claim that they were stereotyped in past eras, absent a careful study of the artwork's period reception. Since we don't have consensus on the definitions of a social construct as elusive and evolving as race, because all representational artworks rely on visual shorthand to convey meaning, and because we bring to artworks internalized racial values, we need to appreciate that the existence of stereotyped characters is historically contingent. Rather than unpacking how it is that artworks which looked stereotyped in 2025 appeared naturalistic in 1925, I want to analyze instead a Motley painting that is universally praised today for the naturalism of its racial depiction, but which gave concern to some Black observers for its proximity to stereotypes in the 1920s. Mending Socks is in the Ackland Museum at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Created in 1924, the canvas depicts the artist's paternal grandmother, Emily Sims Motley, seated in a busy domestic interior as she darns a coarsely knit green sock. It was one of Motley's most widely exhibited and admired early paintings and his most discussed canvas from the interwar period. Grandmother Motley sits in a middle-class domestic interior. Her class standing is suggested by the framed oval painting in the background, neat and intensely lit interior, her brooch and pristine white blouse, the brightly patterned tablecloth, books, and the large silver ornamental fruit bowl on the table beside her. The painting offered a radical visual break from the dominant way in which elderly Black women had and were being depicted in American art. In a more standard portrayal, we have William Henry Snyder, who used a soft-focused photographic style that harkened back to Jean Racine's, produced most popularly from the 1830s through the 1860s. In his 1885 Darning by the Hearth, we see the interior of a ramshackle and dimly lit domestic space in which a Black woman in tattered dress and apron sits in a rocking chair with intent focus on her work. While the painting dates to the penultimate decade of the 19th century, viewers were hard-pressed to say if the scene represented antebellum or postbellum society. An older style of painting was coupled with Black living conditions and a type of work that had changed little over time. Within the logic of the painting, the movement from slavery to freedom made scant difference to Black Americans. While the female figures in both Snyder's and Motley's paintings strike similar poses in their rocking chairs as they engage in identical labor, the canvases are studies in difference. A backward-looking and nostalgic style versus a modern one, a decrepit versus a well-maintained interior, a darkened versus a brightly lit space, a poor versus a middle-class sitter, a type versus an individual, and an identity limited to darning versus one that had many facets. Motley left detailed descriptions of his painting's genesis, as he explained in interviews, quote, "It is a painting of my grandmother on the paternal side, 82 years old when painted. I loved my grandmother very much. I tried very hard to surround her with those things she loved best. Above her head on the wall hangs her crucifix she loved so well, and in the upper left corner of the canvas hangs a portrait of a young lady, her mistress during the days of slavery, which is an oval-shaped picture. They gave her the picture when she was freed, and she took care of that, oh, like a very valuable diamond or something. She had it in the house there in a closet, so when I started the painting, I told her, I'm going to put it in the painting, and she said, oh, how beautiful that will be, close quote. Over his career, Motley accommodated foundations, patrons, art historians, and reporters interested in his work with interviews and written explanations of his art and working process. And there is strong evidence suggesting that he shared much of the background information quoted above, which are with a range of contacts in the 1920s. The Harman Foundation compiled information on the artists who loaned works to its 1929 traveling show, Exhibit of Fine Arts by American Negro Artists. In Motley's file, they wrote, quote, "His work covers a wide range of subjects, and his paintings in this exhibit have been said to reveal several phases of Negro development. The Octoroon Girl is quite representative of the northern metropolitan life. Mending Socks savors of slave days. The Southern Mammy, with the suggestion of her status, brought out by the picture of the mistress in the corner," close quote. Mending Socks received extensive discussion in the press, and reviewers in both the white and black press explained the significance of the portrait hanging in the upper left of the composition. On February 3rd, 1925, the white art critic for the Chicago Daily News, Margaret Williams, wrote, quote, "Mending Socks is a picture of his old grandmother who is 86 years old and beseeks a sympathy and understanding of long standing between the ambitious young painter and the careworn old negress. The faithful old mammy toils to the last as she sits in her rocking chair and darns the coarse family socks with her worn hands. Her crucifix hangs on the wall beside her, and nearby is the old kerosene lamp and the highly colored portrait of her young mistress, relics of her early life in the South," close quote. Over the next 2 weeks, black publications used Williams' copy to inform their readers about Mending Socks and Motley's success more generally. It was then common for smaller newspapers to republish either credited or uncredited copy from larger regional or national papers. 2 days after the original review was published, the Afro-American printed an uncredited and edited version of Williams' article. The modified description of the painting read, "Mending Socks is a picture of his old grandmother who is 86 years old and beseeks a sympathy and understanding of long standing between the ambitious young painter and the careworn old lady." And then the rest of it continues as per the original. The modifications made by the editors of the Afro-American are significant. In the description of Mending Socks in the files of the Harman Foundation and in the original review that appeared in the pages of the Chicago Daily News, there are signs of nostalgia for the antebellum South. The foundation claimed that Mending Socks savors of slave days through its depiction of a Southern mammy with the suggestion of her status. And the white newspaper wrote of the toil of the faithful old mammy. The references to an old negress and faithful old mammy are excised from the report in the Afro-American. The modified paragraph preserves the description of the relationship between the artist and his grandmother, while toning down that between the grandmother and her former mistress. Motley's descriptions of Mending Socks to interviewers, the Harman's Foundation's analysis of his artwork, and the exhibition reviews in the white and the black press all mention the relationship between former slave and former mistress, with the white sources labeling the slave a mammy. In the 1920s, the mammy was among black Americans' most reviled stereotypes, the archetypical caretaker responsible for nursing and raising white children under slavery, who was routinely depicted as elderly, asexual, heavyset, religious, content, and fiercely devoted to her charges. Depictions of mammies and of their warm relations with their former owners featured prominently in late 19th and early 20th century novels, short stories, plays, paintings, motion pictures that catered to white consumers. Visit from the Old Mistress by Winslow Homer pictures a luxuriously dressed white woman facing 3 simply clad black women and a child in a roughly hewn cabin illuminated by the fire in the open hearth. Homer's first biographer, William Howe Downs, described the black women's depiction in 1911. Quote, "3 former slaves are observed and described most vividly and keenly in their solemnity and demeanor and humility of their expression and the evident awe which the presence of the old mistress inspires. There is a blending of pathos and humor which belongs to the situation. The position and expression of the mammy sitting on the stool near the fireplace is admirably caught," close quote. Whether depicted on page or canvas, female former slaves displayed a docile subservience perfectly fitted to life under either slavery or Jim Crow. Black activism against the mammy stereotype reached a peak during the national debate in 1923 over how the mammy of the antebellum South would be remembered. Just months before Motley began work on mending socks, the Senate passed and the House debated a bill that authorized, quote, the erection as a gift to the people of the United States on public grounds of the United States in the city of Washington, D.C., a monument in memory of the faithful colored mammies of the South, close quote. The proposal originated with the Jefferson Davis chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a hereditary association of white women whose ancestors fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, which was dedicated to advocating an idealized narrative of the war in the antebellum South. Citing the important work of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the chief advocate of the bill in the U.S. House of Representatives, Charles Stedman of North Carolina, explained, quote, the fidelity of these colored mammies has scarcely a parallel in history. The safety and comfort of their children, as they called the boys and girls whom they nursed, gave them contentment and happiness. No class of any race of people in bondage could be found anywhere who lived more free from care and distress. The very few who are left look back to those days as the happy and golden hours of their lives, close quote. The congressional debate on the monument ignited passionate backlash from Black citizens across the country, led by the National Association of Colored Women and Black newspaper editors, who saw the memorial as both a rewriting of history and as it means to impose a docile ideal on the 20th century. One of the era's largest circulation Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, branded the proposed monument disgraceful and the worst insult to the race. The Black-owned Philadelphia Tribune argued in 1923 that a monument to Black mammies was an affront to, quote, every American citizen that descends from those saintly women who were sacrificed to the avaricious, beastly natures of Southern gentlemen, close quote. Invoking the citizenship of Black Americans, the editorial pointedly disrupted the white stereotype of the mammy as a sexless slave devoted to the maintenance of the white household by highlighting her defenselessness in the face of white sexual predation. And then turning from the past to the present, the editorial went on to claim, quote, these men would erect a monument to commemorate subservience. Servility is the idea they desire branded and scorched into the brain and heart of every American who happens to be of African lineage, close quote. Finally, the Black-owned St. Louis Argus newspaper wrote, quote, no subject has brought forth a more unanimous protest, except lynching, since the Civil War, than has the proposed Black mammy statue, close quote. All of this surely sheds light on why the Afro-American likely chose to edit Williams' description of mending socks to excise reference to a faithful old mammy. The editors surely sought to diminish the associations of contentment and subservience that whites wrote into and read into a range of literary and pictorial texts depicting Black characters. In their support of a painter who depicted African American characters in novel ways, the editors of the Afro-American worked to reduce the likelihood of their readers seeing Motley's painting perpetuating a reviled stereotype that was firmly ingrained in white American culture. A painting that has generated nothing but glowing assessments from 21st century historians for its naturalistic and stereotype-free depiction of an elderly Black sitter clearly had more complex resonances for at least some Black viewers in the 1920s. The absence of recorded Black criticism of the painting for reproducing the mammy stereotype may even be partially linked to the efforts of the Afro-American to pull it back from such reviled tropes. Artworks deemed free of stereotypes look naturalistic to viewers for one of two reasons. When stereotypes embedded within artworks accord with viewer expectations, or when audiences project their internalized stereotypes onto artworks, the artworks appear to represent the world as it is. Recall that white audiences did not remark on stereotypes in the painting, even as they characterized it as a depiction of a faithful old mammy that savors of slave days, descriptions that black audiences would have readily interpreted as stereotyped. Internalized stereotypes don't look stereotypical. Artworks also register as naturalistic when they break from dominant narrative or stylistic conventions that viewers understand to be arbitrarily associated with the designated race. Most black viewers saw the painting as naturalistic because of its distance from the era's depiction of elderly black women as backward, poor, uneducated, and mired in menial labor. We tend to assume that stereotyping is binary. A representation is either stereotyped or not. My brief analysis of Mending Socks suggests otherwise. I maintain that the simplifications at the heart of stereotypes are innate to representational art. It may not have much analytic payoff to note that all representational artworks are stereotyped, but it remains technically true. In addition, white audiences did not remark on stereotypes in the painting, even as their responses demonstrated how the canvas either reflected or triggered dominant stereotypes of the era. And finally, while most black viewers saw the work as a naturalistic depiction of a black sitter, some feared the proximity of the work to damaging stereotypes and worked to rehabilitate the painting. As I hope you see, the mechanisms by which stereotypes operate are vastly more complex than is typically assumed. My approach to visual and literary texts owes several debts to David. While my scholarly writing does not have the same playful tone as much as I lament it, I've tried to emulate his clarity of prose to ensure the accessibility of my work to students and general academic readers. He's inspired me to analyze an eclectic range of cultural products, and I consistently work to make normal artworks look strange and strange artworks look normal by returning to them the unique discursive context of their creation. I've devoted considerable attention to illuminating how works of art can mean diametrically opposed things to audiences of different subject positions and to viewers at temporal removed from one another. And I've been attentive to recuperating perspectives and conditions of those historically left out of the story of American art. In contrast to David's approach, mine evinces a skepticism of close looking. What I see and don't see is a function of my psychology and the cultural context in which I live. To my eye, Black Belt contains stereotyped characters and Mending Socks does not, and these observations tell me nothing about what the artworks meant for their audiences in the 1920s. Therefore, I interpret those elements of visual and literary text for which there is evidence of their period visibility. There are many intriguing objects included in Mending Socks: an antique kerosene lamp, brooch depicting the sitter's daughter, crucifix, patterned tablecloth inspired by Native American designs, books, and a figurine pincushion, all of which are doubtlessly temptations to David as raw material for his readings. I can see his mind turning. My rules of engagement are clearly more restrictive than David's. In his hands, the artwork's visual evidence is a key jumping-off spot for wide-ranging interpretations. Every research method has built-in advantages and disadvantages. I gravitated over time to an approach that was grounded in the artifact's period reception. It grew out of my professional desire to be able to defend my approach to historians and a psychological need not to contribute to the American public's growing indifference to truth and professional expertise. I'd experienced a creeping unease with how my earlier, more imaginative and less historically grounded work, at least as I now take it, was part of the post-structuralist wave that may have given succor to those who questioned the existence of facts. While comfortable with the claims I make for what period audiences of Mending Socks experienced, I acknowledge that I'm unable to recuperate the full extent of the painting's period significance. The weakness of my art history is precisely David's strength, and its strength is its abundance. On the one hand, he's consistently connected individual works of literature, film, and fine arts to a dizzying array of European and American political events, social movements, consumer culture, literary theories, and to other works of art that span centuries. And on the other, he's dependably accounted for the voices of those who are less likely to be preserved in the historical record. Picturing a Nation struck many critics as limitless in its readings and dogged in its efforts to recover the 19th century perspectives of women and Black Americans in an era in which such efforts were still novel among white male art historians, and at a time when Americanist art historians of color were few. My approach relies on the creation and preservation of textual evidence, while David's works to fill in gaps that exist due to the range of historical inequities endemic to US society. My readings are narrower and more restrained. David's are more abundant and evocative. Neither of us get it right, so much as each of us craft art histories that are ultimately expressions of our unique outlooks and values. David's abundant and evocative scholarship has always struck me as uniquely generous. As I've recounted, his readings make room for a plethora of perspectives, and his prose and humor make his writing more accessible than that of the average academic. But his work displays a more literal generosity too. As a graduate student, I was eager to develop my own academic voice and to demarcate my unique contributions to my fields. In the academy, part of finding one's voice sometimes entails burying the voices of others. David taught me that it did not diminish my work to be generous in my citation of the scholars who had laid the theoretical or historical foundations for my work. David's in-text name-checking of scholars is copious, and his notes generous in their acknowledgement of others. For a scholar intent on overturning the apple cart of American art history, he is noticeably restrained in using the work of other scholars as foils. These professional examples of generosity are an extension of David and Libby's generosity in the world. How many of you have been entertained at their homes over the years, whether at graduate school, Colby, Wake, or at one of David's many sabbatical locations? The Lubins have always been the most generous of hosts, and their hospitality is all the more appealing for the fact that Libby is an exceptional cook. When I reflect on all that I owe to David, I have no doubt as to my greatest debt. It's that he's taught me perspective. I don't want to claim that academics are uniquely predisposed to insecurity and to experiencing slights, but they are. There's a morass of concerns that gnaw at academics over the arc of their careers, hollowing them out from the inside, if I can be honest. We endlessly compared ourselves to our peers when it comes to our graduate schools, jobs, publications, and professional recognition. David taught me not to wallow in my insecurities and to lose sight of the reality that all of us struggle, that joy need not be relative. He's helped me diminish my entanglements in these unhealthy comparisons, to focus on what I can control and to take pleasure in what I've achieved. His own anxieties have not occluded from him the reality that the struggles of those a generation or two behind him are necessarily more acute. As David has always been keen to mentor and support younger generations of scholars. It's a lesson of care and compassion that I've tried hard to model in my own life, because amid all the uncertainty and pain of our world, it's a concrete way that one can both exercise control and contribute to the welfare of others. I'm not yet ready to eulogize David. That's many decades forward. He has his foibles. His indecision is legion. He takes way too long to order in restaurants, asking your thoughts on menu items you've never tried, engaging the waitstaff in prolonged conversations on his options, and not infrequently glancing at dishes and other booze. and at times even quizzing patrons at neighboring tables on the wisdom of their selections. Even after placing his order, it's possible that he'll need to change it as he reflects on the choice. David wants to make the best decision, and he's preternaturally aware that there are different virtues to almost all of his available choices. Dining with him is not unlike reading his work. He's also a pack rat without rival. It's not merely an old receipt from a long bankrupt bookstore in New Haven or an out-of-focus photograph of a department store window display he took in Toronto, but an occasion to reminisce about what he was thinking and feeling when the relics and the experiences were new. If you'll entertain him, he'd be delighted to show you a copy-edited manuscript from a book he published in the last century and relive the drama of the late revisions he made to the consternation of the editor and the production team. I have little doubt that he would have retired years ago if the prospect of cleaning out his office did not loom so large. Libby has been very clear that the piles of books are not coming home. But the flip side of his nostalgia is that he remembers your important milestones and experiences too. He'd be almost as interested in hearing about your receipts, photographs, and long ago published manuscripts, and he'd be just as interested in hearing about your entree. If his scholarship does not offer sufficient proof, let me confirm it. David loves people and is fascinated by our shared human experience. My life's trajectory has been too aleatory for me to say with any confidence what would have become of me if I hadn't started my undergraduate studies at Colby, if I hadn't taken an art history survey course to fulfill a distribution requirement, and if I hadn't been assigned to this guy's discussion section. I went off to college with no interest in the arts, convinced that I would major in economics, eventually get an MBA, and go into business. It's quite possible that without David's influence, I would have never given the arts and humanities a second thought. What I do know is that David has made my life richer. He started me on an intellectual journey of questioning, sensitized me to the complexity of society and the plethora of perspectives that animate cultural productions. And he's made me more attentive to the experiences of those around me. I was privileged to be there in Maine during his first year of teaching, and I'm honored to be here with all of you in North Carolina to mark his final year in the classroom. Thank you, David, for everything.